The dust never stopped. It covered everything: the canvas tops of the wagons, the tired faces of the travelers, and the dreams they carried west. For 3 months now, the wagon train had been crawling across the endless plains and rocky hills, heading toward California and the promise of a better life. Among the 43 families making this dangerous journey was a young woman named Mary. She had joined her late husband's brother and his wife after losing everything back in Missouri. Her husband had died in a farming accident just 6 months after their wedding, leaving her with nothing but grief and the clothes on her back. When her brother-in-law Thomas decided to try his luck in the California goldfields, he offered to take her along. What choice did she have? A woman alone in 1864 had few options. The wagon train moved like a giant snake across the landscape, with families spread out in a long line to avoid each other's dust. Children walked alongside the wagons to save weight, and women took turns driving the oxen when the men needed rest. Everyone had their job to do, and everyone knew that survival depended on working together. Mary had grown thin during the journey. The constant worry, the poor food, and the endless walking had worn her down. She helped cook meals over smoky fires, mended clothes by candlelight, and tried to stay positive when everything seemed hopeless. The other women had been kind to her at first, but as the journey grew harder, people became more focused on their own families. The trouble started when they reached the Arizona territory. The nights had grown cold, and everyone knew winter was coming fast. They needed to cross the mountains before the snow made travel impossible. That's when the sickness came. It began with little Anna, the blacksmith's daughter. One morning, she couldn't keep her breakfast down, and by evening she was burning with fever. Her mother tried everything: cool cloths, herb teas, prayers, but nothing helped. Within 2 days, Anna was gone. The wagon master, a tough man named Captain Reynolds, made the hard decision to bury the child and keep moving. But the sickness didn't stop with Anna. Soon, 3 more children fell ill with the same symptoms. Then old Mr. Patterson, who had been feeling poorly for days, collapsed while hitching his oxen. Fear spread through the wagon train faster than the disease itself. Families started avoiding each other, afraid to get too close. Mothers kept their children away from the sick wagons, and men spoke in worried whispers about what would happen if more people got ill. Mary felt the first signs on a Tuesday morning. Her stomach felt queasy, and her head pounded like someone was hitting it with a hammer. She tried to hide it, knowing how people had started looking at the sick families. But by afternoon, she could barely stand up straight. The fever hit her like a wall of fire. One minute she was helping Thomas's wife, Elizabeth, prepare the evening meal. The next, she was on her knees, shaking uncontrollably. Elizabeth called for Thomas, and when he saw Mary's condition, his face went pale. "It's the same sickness," Elizabeth whispered, backing away. "The same one that took little Anna." For 3 days, Mary lay in the back of Thomas's wagon, drifting in and out of consciousness. Elizabeth tried to care for her, bringing water and thin soup, but Thomas grew more worried by the hour. Other families were watching them now, whispering and pointing. Some had already moved their wagons farther away. Captain Reynolds came to check on her on the 4th day. He was a practical man who had led wagon trains for 15 years, and he had seen this situation too many times before. He looked at Mary's burning face and shook his head. "She's not getting better," he told Thomas quietly. "And winter's coming fast. We've got maybe 3 weeks before the mountain passes close for the season." Thomas knew what the captain was suggesting, but he couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. Elizabeth stood beside him, tears streaming down her face. "There might be another way," Thomas said desperately. "Maybe if we just wait a few more days." "We can't wait," Reynolds interrupted. "I've got 40 other families counting on me to get them through alive. Every day we delay means more people could die from cold and snow." So that evening, Reynolds called a meeting of all the adult men in the train. They gathered around a small fire, their faces grim in the flickering light. The discussion was heated but brief. Some argued for waiting, others for pressing on with the sick. But in the end, the harsh mathematics of frontier survival won out. They would leave the sick behind. It was an old and terrible tradition of the westward journey. When people were too ill to travel and threatened the survival of the group, they were left with supplies and prayers. Sometimes they recovered and caught up later. More often Mary was barely conscious when they told her. Through the fog of fever, she heard Thomas's voice breaking as he explained what had to happen. Elizabeth was sobbing openly now, but she didn't argue. They all knew the rules of the trail. They carried her to a spot by a small creek, where at least she would have water. Elizabeth gave her an extra blanket and packed a bag with what food they could spare: some hardtack biscuits, a bit of salt pork, and a small bag of coffee beans. Thomas left her his spare canteen, filled to the brim. "I'm sorry, Mary," he whispered. Kneeling beside her, "I'm so sorry." She tried to speak, to tell him she understood, but only a whisper came out. The fever was burning through her like wildfire. She could barely keep her eyes open. As the sun came up the next morning, the wagon train began moving again. One by one, the families packed up and fell into line. Some of the women were crying, and a few men stopped to look back at the small figure by the creek, but they all kept moving. Mary lay there listening to the sounds grow fainter, the creaking of wagon wheels, the lowing of oxen, the voices of children asking questions their parents couldn't answer. Then there was only silence and the sound of water flowing over rocks. For the first day, she was too sick to do anything but lie still and try to sip water. The fever made everything feel like a strange dream. Sometimes she thought she heard voices or saw familiar faces. But when she tried to focus, there was nothing there but empty desert and sky. By the second day, the fever began to break, but she was weak as a newborn kitten. She managed to eat a few bites of hardtack, though it felt like chewing cardboard. The creek water was cold and sweet, and she thanked God for that small mercy. On the third day, she felt clear-headed for the first time in a week. That's when the full weight of her situation hit her. She was alone in the wilderness, hundreds of miles from any town, with almost no food and no way to travel. The wagon train was long gone, probably 50 miles ahead by now. She looked up at the sky and saw dark shapes circling high above. Vultures, they were patient creatures, and they knew how this usually ended. Mary closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. She had lost her husband, her home, and now even the harsh family that had taken her in. What was left to pray for? That's when she heard the sound of hoofbeats in the distance, growing closer. The hoofbeats stopped just beyond the rocks where Mary couldn't see. She held her breath, not daring to move. Out here in the wilderness, riders could mean salvation or death. There was no way to know which until it was too late. A shadow fell across her face, blocking out the afternoon sun. When she opened her eyes, she saw a man standing over her, as still as stone. He was tall and lean, with long black hair tied back and skin bronzed by years under the desert sun. His clothes were a mix of traditional and traded items: buckskin, pants, a cotton shirt, and boots that had seen many miles. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Mary had heard terrible stories about Indians attacking wagon trains, scalping families, stealing children. But this man just stood there, studying her with dark eyes that seemed to see everything. He knelt down beside her and placed the back of his hand against her forehead, checking for fever. His touch was gentle, like her grandmother's had been. When Mary was a sick child, when he spoke, his English was careful but clear. "You are far from your people," he said quietly. Mary tried to sit up but felt dizzy and weak. They left me," she whispered. "I was sick. They couldn't wait." The man nodded, as if this was not surprising to him. He had seen the wagon trains before, had watched from hidden places as they struggled across his homeland. He knew their rules, their harsh choices. "I am called Joseph," he said, using the English name traders had given him years ago. His real name was longer, with sounds that white tongues couldn't make. "You are dying here." It wasn't a question. Mary could see the truth in his eyes. Without help, she would be dead within days. The little food she had wouldn't last, and she was too weak to hunt or travel. Joseph stood and walked back to his horse. It's a strong paint pony that watched everything with intelligent eyes. He spoke to the animal in his own language, words that sounded like music to Mary's ears. Then he returned with a leather water bag and a small pouch. "Drink," he said, helping her sit up. The water was cool and tasted of mountain streams. From the pouch, he pulled out strips of dried meat and some kind of cake made from ground corn and berries. Mary ate slowly, trying not to seem too hungry, though she was starving. Joseph watched her carefully, as if deciding something important. Finally, he spoke again. "My grandmother is a healer. She knows the old ways, the plant medicines. But my people—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your soldiers hunt. Us. They want to put us on the reservation, far from our homes." Mary had heard about the troubles with the Indians, though she had never understood the full story. The newspapers back in Missouri painted all Indians as violent savages, but this man seemed nothing like those stories. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Joseph was quiet for a long time, staring out at the desert landscape. 2 winters ago, soldiers came to my village. They killed my wife and my son. They were trying to kill all of us, to make us leave our land. His voice was steady, but Mary could hear the pain underneath. "I could let you die here. Maybe I should. But ... He looked at her again. "You are not a soldier. You are just a person, lost and alone." The weight of his words settled over them both. Here was a man who had every reason to hate white people. Yet he was offering to save her life. "If I take you to my grandmother, it will bring danger to my family," Joseph continued. "We are hiding in the canyons, keeping away from the soldiers. But you will die if you stay here." Mary understood the choice he was offering her. She could stay by the creek and die alone, or trust this stranger who had already lost so much to her people. "I don't want to bring trouble to your family," she said softly. Joseph almost smiled at that. "You're one small woman, half dead from sickness. How much trouble can you be?" He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight when her legs threatened to give out. She was shocked at how weak she had become. The fever had burned through her like fire, leaving her as fragile as paper. Joseph's horse stood patiently as he helped Mary climb up behind him. She had never ridden double on a horse before, and she was frightened of falling off. But Joseph's presence was steadying, and the horse seemed to understand that it carried precious cargo. They rode for what felt like hours, though Mary's sense of time was still confused from the fever. The landscape changed around them, from open desert to rocky hills, then into narrow canyons with red stone walls that stretched up toward the sky like cathedral spires. As they traveled, Joseph told her about the land they were crossing. He pointed out plants that could heal sickness, rocks that held water, and signs that showed which animals had passed through. It was a different way of seeing the world, one that Mary had never imagined. "Your people see the desert as empty," Joseph said, "but it is full of life, if you know how to look." They stopped several times to rest, and Joseph gave her more water and food. Each time, Mary felt a little stronger. The dried meat was salty and tough, but it gave her energy. The corn cake was sweet and filling, unlike anything she had tasted. Before, as the sun began to set, they entered a hidden canyon that twisted and turned like a snake. Joseph guided his horse carefully along narrow paths that seemed to disappear into the rock walls. Mary couldn't believe people could live in such a place. But then she smelled wood smoke and heard voices. The canyon opened into a small valley hidden from the outside world. There were several shelters built against the rock walls, some made of stone and others of brush and animal hides. Gardens of corn, beans, and squash grew in patches of good soil, and sheep grazed on the sparse grass. People came out to meet them, men, women, and children, who stared at Mary with curiosity and concern. They spoke rapidly in their own language, clearly asking Joseph what he was doing bringing a white woman to their secret place. An old woman emerged from one of the larger shelters. Her hair was silver white and braided with colored threads, and her face was lined with years of wisdom and sorrow. She wore a traditional dress decorated with silver jewelry that caught the last light of day. This was Joseph's grandmother, the healer he had spoken of. She looked at Mary with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through to her soul. The old woman spoke to Joseph in their language, her voice stern and questioning. Joseph answered her respectfully, but firmly. Mary couldn't understand the words, but she could hear the argument building between them. Other people gathered around, adding their voices to the discussion. Finally, the old woman held up her hand for silence. She walked over to Mary, who was still sitting on the horse, swaying. With exhaustion, the healer placed her weathered hands on Mary's face and looked deep into her eyes. For a moment that felt like eternity, the two women studied each other. One young and desperate, the other old and wise. One white and one Indian, from worlds that were supposed to be enemies. Then the old woman nodded and spoke a single word in English. "Come." Mary woke up on a soft bed made of woven blankets and animal furs. The air smelled of sage and wood smoke, completely different from anything she had known before. Sunlight filtered through the entrance of what she realized was a traditional shelter, built into the canyon wall itself. Her body felt different. The burning fever was gone, replaced by a deep tiredness that came from real healing. Someone had dressed her in a clean cotton dress, soft and comfortable against her skin. Her own clothes were nowhere to be seen. An old woman sat nearby, grinding something in a stone bowl. It was Joseph's grandmother, the healer who had agreed to help her. The woman looked up and smiled when she saw Mary was awake. "You have slept for 3 days," the old woman said in careful English. "The sickness is leaving your body, but slowly." Mary tried to sit up and found she was much stronger than before. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved my life." The old woman who told Mary to call her grandmother Anna had indeed saved her life. She had used plants and medicines that white doctors had never heard of. Teas made from desert willow bark to fight the fever, poultices of crushed herbs to draw poison from her body. Ancient songs and ceremonies that seemed to call healing spirits to help. "Your people," Anna said, continuing to grind her herbs, "they think they know everything about medicine? They know nothing about the real healing." As Mary grew stronger over the following days, she began to see the world through completely different eyes. This hidden canyon was home to about 30 people. Joseph's extended family, who had refused to go to the government reservation, had chosen to live free in their ancestral lands, even though it meant hiding from soldiers and living with constant danger. The children were the first to warm up to her. They were curious about her light skin and strange hair, giggling when she tried to speak their language and getting the words all wrong. A little girl named Dancing Bird became her special friend. Patiently teaching her simple words and showing her how things worked in their world, Joseph visited her every day, bringing news from the outside world and helping her understand the customs of his people. He told her about their beliefs, their connection to the land, and their history in these canyons that went back hundreds of years. "Your people see land as something to own," Joseph explained as they walked beside the small stream that ran through the canyon, "like you own a horse or a cooking pot. But we see it as our mother. You cannot own your mother." Mary had never thought about land that way before. Back in Missouri, people bought and sold farms, fought over property lines, and measured their success by how much ground they controlled. But here, she was learning about a different relationship with the earth. The women of the village slowly began to include her in their daily work. They taught her to weave baskets from thin strips of willow, their fingers moving so fast she could barely follow. They showed her which plants were good for food, which ones healed sickness, and which ones were dangerous. Mary learned to grind corn into flour using a stone matot, her arms aching from the unfamiliar work. She helped tend the small gardens, where corn, beans, and squash grew together in a pattern the women called the Three Sisters. She discovered that these plants helped each other grow, the corn giving the beans something to climb, the beans putting nutrients back into the soil, and the squash leaves keeping weeds away. Everything here had a purpose, a reason, a connection to everything else. It was so different from the world she had known, where people often worked against nature instead of with it. But it wasn't always easy. Some of the men in the village didn't trust her, and she could feel their eyes watching her wherever she went. They had lost family members to white soldiers, had their homes burned, their animals stolen. They couldn't understand why Joseph had brought this danger into their safe place. One evening, as Mary was helping prepare the evening meal, she overheard 2 men arguing with Joseph in their own language. She couldn't understand most of the words, but their anger was clear. They kept pointing at her and making sharp gestures. Later, Joseph found her sitting alone by the stream, tears running down her face. They want me to leave, she said without looking at him. I can see it in their eyes. They're afraid I'll bring soldiers here. Joseph sat down beside her on a flat rock. For a long time, they both watched the water flow over the stones, each lost in their own thoughts. 2 years ago, soldiers came to our main village, Joseph said finally. They said we had to leave, go to a place called Bosque Redondo, a reservation, where the government wanted to keep all our people. His voice grew quiet. My wife, singing water, she was pregnant with our second child. She couldn't travel fast enough when we tried to run. Mary felt her heart break for him. She had lost her husband, but Joseph had lost everything. His wife, his unborn child, his home, his whole way of life. The soldiers caught up to us at a waterhole, Joseph continued. They were supposed to take us prisoner, but some of them had been drinking. They started shooting, picked up a small stone and threw it into the water. Singing Water tried to protect our little boy. They both died in my arms. They sat in silence as the sun set behind the canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Mary understood now why some of the men didn't trust her. To them, she represented the people who had destroyed their world. But you're not those soldiers, Joseph said, looking at her directly. And I'm not the man who wants revenge for everything that was taken from me. We are just two people who found each other when we were both lost. Over the following weeks, Mary threw herself into learning everything she could about her new life. She discovered that Grandmother Anna was not just a healer, but also a keeper of stories, the oral history of their people that went back generations. In the evenings, when the work was done, Anna would tell tales of ancient heroes, talking animals, and the creation of the world. Mary found herself thinking less and less about her old life, the wagon train, her brother, in-law Thomas, even her late husband seemed like memories from someone else's life. Here in this hidden canyon, she was becoming someone new. She learned to cook over an open fire, to sew with sinew and bone needles, to recognize the calls of different birds and what they meant. She discovered she had a talent for pottery, her hands seeming to know how to shape clay into beautiful bowls and water jars. But most of all, she found herself watching Joseph. She noticed how gently he treated the animals, how patiently he taught the young men to hunt, how carefully he listened when the elders spoke. She saw the sadness that lived behind his eyes, but also the kindness that had made him save her life. And sometimes, they were working together or walking through the canyon, she caught him watching her too. There was something growing between them, something neither of them had expected. When he first found her dying by that creek, something that would change both their lives forever. The first snow came early that year, dusting the canyon walls with white powder that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun. Mary stood at the entrance of her shelter, watching the flakes fall silently into the valley below. She had been with Joseph's people for 3 months now. The world she had left behind felt like a distant dream. She pulled her woolen shawl tighter, around her shoulders, a gift from the women of the village who had finally accepted her as one of their own. Her hands were no longer soft and pale like a lady's, but strong and brown from working in the sun. Her hair, once pinned up properly, now hung in a single braid down her back, woven with small beads that Dancing Bird had given her. The snow will trap us in the canyon until spring, Joseph said, appearing beside her with quiet steps. He had a way of moving that made no sound, something Mary was still learning to do. Are you worried about supplies? Mary asked, though she knew the answer. The people here planned everything carefully, storing food and gathering materials long before they were needed. Joseph smiled. Grandmother Anna says this will be a good winter for stories and making things. The long nights give us time for the work that feeds the soul. They walked together toward the central fire where the community gathered each evening. Mary had come to love these times when everyone shared the day's events, told stories, and worked on crafts by firelight. The children would fall asleep listening to the elders' tales, and the adults would discuss important matters affecting their small group. Tonight felt different, though. Mary noticed people glancing at her and Joseph, whispering quietly among themselves. Grandmother Anna sat in her usual place, but her expression was more serious than usual. There is something we must discuss, Anna announced when everyone had gathered. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had lived through many winters and seen many changes. Joseph tensed beside Mary. He had been expecting this conversation for weeks. Our young man has been spending much time with the white woman, Anna continued, looking directly at Joseph. The whole village can see what is growing between them. Mary felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She had tried to be careful to hide her feelings, but apparently she hadn't been as successful as she thought. Some say this is dangerous, Anna went on, that mixing our blood with theirs will bring trouble to our people. Others say love is a gift from the Creator and we should not waste such gifts. An older man named Grey Wolf spoke up. She is one of them. The people who killed my brother, who burned our homes. How can we trust her with our most sacred traditions? She has proven herself, argued Redbird Woman, one of the weavers who had become Mary's friend. She works hard. She learns our ways. She shows respect for our customs. Her heart is good. The debate went on for over an hour, with different people sharing their views. Mary wanted to disappear into the ground. She had never meant to cause such division in the community that had saved her life. Finally, Joseph stood up. I have something to say. The gathering fell silent. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly. 2 years ago, I wanted to die, Joseph said, his voice steady but filled with pain. When I lost Singing Water and my son, I thought my life was over. I stopped caring about anything, food, sleep, even staying alive. Looked around at the faces of his family and friends. You all know this. You saw me wasting away like a ghost. Several people nodded. They remembered those dark months when Joseph had barely spoken, barely eaten, barely existed. When I found Mary by the creek, I almost left her there, Joseph continued. Part of me wanted to. She was one of them, the people who had taken everything from me. But something stopped me. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Maybe it was seeing someone else who had been abandoned and left to die? Maybe it was remembering what Singing Water always said, that hate only makes more hate. Mary felt tears running down her cheeks. She had never heard Joseph speak so openly about his feelings. Mary has brought something back to life in me that I thought was gone forever, Joseph said. Not just love, but hope. The hope that people from different worlds can understand each other, can care for each other. He looked directly at Grandmother Anna. I want to ask for permission to marry her, according to our customs. The silence that followed was so complete that Mary could hear her own heartbeat. This was the moment that would decide her future, not just whether she could marry Joseph, but whether she would be truly accepted into this community or remain. Forever an outsider, Grandmother Anna studied both of them for a long time. Finally, she spoke. Love is not something we can control or command, she said. It comes like rain in the desert. Sometimes when we expect it, sometimes when we don't. But when it comes, we can choose to let it nourish us or to let it run off and be wasted. She stood up slowly, her old bones creaking. I have watched this woman for 3 months. I have seen her learn our ways, not just with her hands, but with her heart. She shows respect for our traditions, kindness to our children, and loyalty to our family. Anna looked around the circle. More importantly, she has brought joy back to a man who we thought would never smile again. Grey Wolf shook his head. But what about the danger? What if soldiers come looking for her? Soldiers are already looking for us, Anna replied. They want to put us all on the reservation. One more person, especially one who can speak to the white authorities, might even help us someday. The discussion continued late into the night. But gradually, the tide turned in favor of the young couple, the women especially, seemed to understand that Mary had found a home among them and that her love for Joseph was real. When the talking finally ended, Anna gave her decision. If both of you are willing to follow our marriage customs, to have your union blessed by our traditions, then you have my permission. She looked sternly at both of them. But understand this, in our way, marriage is not just between two people. It is between two people and their entire community. You will be responsible not just to each other, but to all of us. The wedding preparations began immediately. Mary learned that Navajo marriages were very different from the simple church ceremonies she had known. There were songs to learn, traditional, foods to prepare, symbolic gifts to be made. The women taught her to weave a special blanket that would be used in the ceremony. Her fingers, now skilled from months of practice, worked the wool into patterns that told the story of her journey, the darkness of being abandoned, the healing power of love, and the bright future she hoped to build. Joseph worked with the men to prepare his part of the ceremony. He crafted silver jewelry using techniques passed down through generations, creating beautiful pieces that would be part of Mary's wedding gifts. Each piece told a story, carried meaning that went far beyond simple decoration. As the winter deepened and the wedding day approached, Mary felt a peace she had never known before. She was about to marry a man who truly understood her, joining a family that had accepted her completely, and starting a new life that honored both her past and her future. The night before the wedding, as she sat by the fire putting finishing touches on her ceremonial dress, Grandmother Anna came to sit beside her. "Are you ready for this?" the old woman asked. "Once you take our name, follow our customs, you will be one of us forever. There will be no going back to your old world." Mary looked around the canyon that had become her home, the people who had become her family, and at Joseph, who had become her heart. "Been ready since the day you said come," she replied. The wedding ceremony took place on a crisp morning in late winter, when the snow on the canyon walls sparkled like scattered jewels. Mary wore the traditional dress that the women had helped her make, soft deerskin decorated with silver buttons and turquoise beads. Her hair was braided with colored ribbons and eagle feathers, symbols of strength and freedom. Joseph stood beside her wearing his finest clothes, his long hair flowing loose over his shoulders. The silver jewelry he had crafted caught the morning light as they stood before Grandmother Anna and the assembled community. The ceremony was unlike anything Mary had ever experienced. There were no written vows or formal prayers. Instead, the couple fed each other corn mush from the same bowl, symbolizing that they would share everything from that day forward. They washed each other's hands with sacred water, showing their commitment to helping each other stay pure in heart and purpose. As the sun reached its highest point, Anna pronounced them married according to the ancient customs. The celebration lasted 3 days, with dancing, storytelling, and feasting that brought joy to everyone in the hidden canyon. But even in the midst of happiness, the outside world was closing in around them. Spring brought disturbing news from the few traders who still dared to visit their hidden valley. The government was increasing pressure on all native tribes to move to reservations. Soldiers were searching the canyons more frequently, and rewards were being offered for information about hostile Indians who refused to surrender. "We can't hide forever," Joseph told Mary one evening, as they walked along the stream that had become their special place. "Sooner or later, they'll find us." Mary had been thinking the same thing. In the months since their wedding, she had become fully integrated into the community. She spoke the language fluently now, could track animals through the desert, and had learned to make medicine from plants. But she also understood the white world in ways that could help her new family. "What if we didn't wait for them to find us?" she suggested carefully. "What if we went to them first?" Joseph stopped walking and stared at her. "You mean surrender?" "Mean negotiate," Mary replied. "I could speak for the people here. I understand both worlds now. Maybe there's a way to find peace without losing everything." The idea was dangerous and controversial. When they presented it to the community, many people were strongly opposed. Grey Wolf argued that any contact with the authorities would lead to disaster. Others feared that Mary's presence would make things worse. A white woman living with Indians might anger the soldiers even more. But Grandmother Anna, whose wisdom everyone respected, saw possibilities that others missed. "The girl speaks truth," Anna said during one of their long discussions. "We cannot hide in this canyon forever. Our children need to learn how to live in the world that is coming, not just the world that was." After weeks of debate, the community decided to try Mary's plan, but they would be careful. Only Joseph, Mary, and 2 elders would make the journey to the nearest army fort. The rest would wait in the canyon, ready to scatter deeper into the wilderness if things went badly. The ride to Fort Sumner took 3 days through country that Mary remembered from her wagon train journey. But now she saw it through different eyes. not as empty wasteland to be crossed, but as homeland filled with sacred places and ancient stories. The fort was a collection of adobe buildings surrounded by wooden walls. Flying the American flag, that had once filled Mary with pride, but now seemed like a symbol of all the pain her new family had endured. The soldiers at the gate were suspicious and hostile. When they saw the small group approaching, they recognized Joseph and the elders as Indians, but Mary's presence confused them. She was clearly white, but dressed in native clothing and speaking both English and Navajo. "I need to speak with your commanding officer," Mary told the sergeant at the gate, using her most authoritative voice. "I have information about the Indians you've been looking for." Major Wilson, the fort commander, was a tired man who had spent too many years fighting wars he didn't fully understand. When Mary was brought to his office, he looked at her with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "You're the woman who disappeared from the Henderson wagon train," he said after she told him her story. "We found evidence of your camp by Willow Creek. Everyone assumed you had died." "I nearly did," Mary replied. "These people saved my life and gave me a home. Now I want to help them find a way to live in peace." What followed were the most difficult negotiations of Mary's life. Major Wilson was not a cruel man, but he had orders to bring all free Indians to the reservation. Joseph and the elders were determined to protect their people's freedom and traditions. Mary found herself translating not just words, but entire ways of thinking. She helped the major understand that the people in the canyon were not dangerous warriors, but families trying to preserve their way of life. She helped Joseph and the elders understand the political pressures that drove government policy. Slowly, for several days of careful discussion, they worked out an agreement that nobody loved, but everyone could accept. The canyon group would be allowed to stay on their land, but they would have to accept government supervision and allow their children to attend school at the fort. In return, they would serve as scouts and guides for the army, using their knowledge of the country to help with peaceful missions rather than warfare. Mary would act as official interpreter and cultural liaison, a job that had never existed before but was desperately needed. The agreement was fragile and imperfect, but it offered hope for a future where two worlds could coexist rather than destroy each other. When they returned to the canyon with news of the agreement, the community's reaction was mixed. Some people were relieved that they could stay on their ancestral lands. Others worried about what government supervision would mean for their traditions and freedom. "Change is coming, whether we want it or not," Grandmother Anna told the gathered families. "The question is whether we help shape that change or let it crush us." Over the following months, Mary and Joseph worked to make the new arrangement succeed. They established a small trading post near the fort, where native craftspeople could sell their jewelry, pottery, and weavings to soldiers and travelers. The income helped support families who had lost their traditional hunting grounds. Mary taught English to the native children while also learning to read and write in Navajo, creating the first written records of stories and customs that had been passed down orally for generations. Joseph trained young men in both traditional skills and the new abilities they would need to survive in a changing world. It wasn't easy. There were conflicts and misunderstandings on both sides. Some soldiers remained prejudiced and hostile. Some tribal members resented any compromise with the white world. Mary and Joseph often found themselves caught in the middle, trusted by neither side completely. But slowly, something new began to emerge. Children who grew up bilingual and bicultural, comfortable in both worlds. Families who maintained their traditions while also adapting to new realities. A community that proved it was possible to honor the past while building a different kind of future. 3 years after their wedding, Mary and Joseph had their first child, a daughter they named Hope. She was born into a world that was still dangerous and uncertain, but also full of new possibilities, as Mary held her baby girl and looked out over the canyon that had become her true home. She thought about the journey that had brought her here. She had lost everything: husband, family, homeland, only to find something richer and more meaningful than she had ever imagined possible. Love had not only saved her life, but it helped create a bridge between two worlds that many people thought could never be connected. It was a legacy she was proud to pass on to her daughter, and to all the children who would grow up knowing that understanding and respect could triumph over fear and hatred, the little girl in her arms would never know a world where such love was impossible. And that, Mary thought, was the greatest gift of all.